Hello, I'm Nick, and this is Today in Philosophy of History for Thursday, 15 August 2024. It is the 255th anniversary of the birth of Napoleon Bonaparte, who was born in the city of Ajaccio on the island of Corsica on this date in 1769. There's been a lot of water under the bridge since Napoleon's time. Napoleon now comes to us from a quarter of a millennium in the past, though he is one of the most important figures of modern history. I would even say that Napoleon is one of the definitive figures of modern history. There's an enormous literature on Napoleon and the Napoleonic Wars that testifies to this. Some of this has come down to us as classics, among the greatest classics of literature, like Tolstoy's War and Peace and Dickens' A Tale of Two Cities. In Alexander Dumas' The Count of Monte Cristo, the story begins in 1915 at the end of the Napoleonic Wars, when Edmond Dantes is arrested on the pretext of being a Bonapartist agent and is thrown into prison where he is no longer a threat to a romantic rival. There are also a lot of films about the Napoleonic Wars, some of which are based on this classic literature. Two of my favorite films of the genre are The Duelists of 1977, based on a short story by Joseph Conrad from 1905, and Master and Commander of 2003, based on a 1969 novel by Patrick O'Brian. In The Duelists, Lieutenant Gabriel Farreau insults his rival, Lieutenant Armand Dubert, by saying, "He never loved the Emperor." And in Master and Commander, Russell Crowe as Captain Jack Aubrey, during gunnery practice, encourages his crew by saying, you want to see a guillotine in Piccadilly? You want to call that raggedy-ass Napoleon your king? You want to hear your children sing the La Marseillaise? The crew responds with a resounding no to each of these questions. In both of these films and in many others, the writers did a great job of showing the passions at work, not as historical artifacts, but as something believable and immediate. Even in the 20th century, we can find ideologically opposed framings of the French Revolution and all that followed in its wake. In The Scarlet Pimpernel, a 1934 film based on the 1905 novel by Baroness Orczy and based on an earlier stage play, a group of secretive English aristocrats serve as a rat line for French aristocrats fleeing the reign of terror. And in Scaramouche, a 1952 film based on a 1921 novel by Raphael Sabatini, the protagonist trains with the greatest swordsman until he can challenge the most experienced swordsman among the aristocrats who have been killing French Republicans by challenging them to duels. So even with mid-century Hollywood, we can find for and against the French Revolution. Despite the quarter of a millennium between Napoleon and ourselves, there's still some feeling of connection between Napoleon and his times and our day. William Faulkner once wrote, "The past is never dead. It's not even past." This is true up to a point, but we do eventually move on, even if we haven't yet fully moved on from Napoleon. Napoleon remains for us what Dutch historian Johan Huizinga called an historical ideal. Huizinga's inaugural lecture of 1915 was Historical Ideals of Life, collected in this collection, Men and Ideas. In it, Huizinga said, quote, "A historical life ideal may be defined as any concept of excellence man projects into the past," unquote. His opening example is Charles the Bold's desire to imitate Caesar, Hannibal, and Alexander the Great. But even as Huizinga was explaining historical ideals, he was acknowledging that their declining power. Huizinga gave his lecture during the First World War, which was one of the events that cut us off from the pre-war past, by interpolating a great discontinuity in history. Huizinga acknowledged in his lecture that the time of historical ideals was largely past. He said, quote, "Historical cultural ideas of a general human purport have apparently passed out of the picture, unquote. And that was already more than 100 years ago during the First World War. With the modern shift from idealizing the past to idealizing the future, what Huizinga called historical ideals have been largely, though not entirely, abandoned, and future ideals have, to a certain extent, replaced them. I suspect few young boys today dream of growing up to be Alexander the Great or Charlemagne or Napoleon. But we don't escape our history as easily as that. One of the weaknesses of modernity and its idealization of the future is it gives the impression that we can renounce the past and go forward unburdened by what has been. But we can't. We always labor under the burden of what has been. And this is fortunate for us. The past isn't a burden, it is a condition for effective action. Human agency in the world in which the future is idealized is arguably less effectual than human agency guided by historical ideals, since future ideals are unrealized possibilities which may or may not prove efficacious in practice, while historical ideals have proved themselves in the only way that matters. The future is uncertain. Its insubstantial ideals can collapse on the slightest contact with the real world. But the past is in our bones, whether we like it or not. Historical ideals have survived the test of time, even if we ignore them. Even if the past is ridiculed and we are encouraged to condemn our ancestors, we carry them within us. Rather than the past being an explicitly entertained ideal that we seek to emulate, it takes on a secret history inside our hearts. It only takes the right symbol at the right moment to evoke feelings that we didn't even know that we had. Francis Parker Yockey understood this. Yockey was an eccentric dude by any standard. He was a lawyer at the Nuremberg trials, but eventually he reacted against this experience. Yockey saw himself as the heir and the continuator of Oswald Spengler, and with Spengler as his muse, Yockey wrote Imperium, the Philosophy of History and Politics, published under a pseudonym in 1948. In this book, he claimed that what makes a figure like Napoleon significant and symbolic is that during the Napoleonic Wars, men fell in the struggle over ideas. Quote, Napoleon's empire, brief though it was laden with symbolic meaning that is still at work in the minds of Western men, and that is, as we shall see, pregnant with the future of the West. High cultures create the greatest wars, but their significance is not merely that they open rivers of blood, but that these men fall in the struggle of ideas, unquote. Yockey wrote that Napoleon's empire was laden with symbolic meaning. But what exactly did Napoleon signify? The answer is that Napoleon symbolized many things. He was many things to many men. Yockey wrote, quote, in high history, men risk all and die for an idea. In primitivity, there is no super-personal idea of this force, but only personal strivings, crude lust for booty, or formless power, unquote. So what were the ideas in the service of which men fell on the battlefield during the Napoleonic Wars? Many of those who died for the sake of reactionary monarchies that were shocked by the French Revolution, appalled by the Reign of Terror, and repulsed by Napoleon himself. Still, these reactionary monarchies had their own ideals. In my episode on Karl von Clausewitz, I quoted a passage that Clausewitz had written in 1812 about Napoleon meeting the Hohenzollern royal family at Tilsit. Napoleon was seen as an ambitious upstart and an interloper among the ancient courts of European nobility. The Hohenzollerns represented the traditional aristocratic privilege that the French Revolution was to overturn, and yet Napoleon and the Hohenzollerns found themselves forced into this diplomatic accommodation that both, no doubt, found to be distasteful. Napoleon is drawn into these ancient traditions that the revolution was to sweep away, as the Hohenzollerns were drawn into paying their respects to a representative of the revolution that would have done with them. Napoleon himself, in having himself crowned emperor, was effectively giving new life to these traditions that he despised as a representative of the revolution. Presumably, this was done in the spirit of compromise, but it didn't impress Clausewitz. Clausewitz had been in the thick of things during the Napoleonic Wars, serving as aide-de-camp to Prince Augustus Ferdinand of Prussia at the Battle of Jena, where Hegel had glimpsed Napoleon. After the utter defeat of the Prussians, he was taken prisoner of war along with 25,000 others and spent 2 years as a prisoner of war in France. For Clausewitz, Napoleon was not a symbol of an ideal, but a symbol of the degradation and humiliation of the aristocratic ideals that had been, up to that time, the chief ideals that had informed European history. This was the ultimate humiliation of the higher being defeated by the lower, the triumph of vulgarity, and the end of an era. Napoleon, in disrespecting the Hohenzollerns in the eyes of Clausewitz, was demonstrating his contempt for everything that had made Europe what it was. This was the revolutionary side of Napoleon as a symbol. Felix Markham said that Napoleon symbolized Jacobinism, and we can understand Jacobinism as the radical face of the French Revolution. The Jacobins were fanatical believers in the revolution. Like communists today, they believed that the ends justified the means, and they were prepared to sacrifice anyone they believed was in their way. Eventually, this became profoundly self-destructive, as is usually the case with radicals. It was the purity spiraling of the Jacobins that led to the Reign of Terror. On the other hand, Napoleon represented these radical forces of the French Revolution, but the revolution also had a less radical aspect that was familiar to all in the proclamation of the rights of man and the Enlightenment ideas of rationality, progress, and modernity. On the other hand, Napoleon also represented an ancient conception of empire and even crowned himself as emperor. He adopted imperial symbols such as the eagle, and every regiment of the Grand Armée had a flagstaff topped with an imperial eagle. He staged an elaborate coronation for himself, employed the regalia of royalty, and specified that his coat of arms should be, quote, azure, with an eagle in the manner of antiquity, colored gold, clutching in its talons a thunderbolt of the same color, unquote. Napoleon even used bees, which are an ancient symbol of the French monarchy. Most importantly, Napoleon symbolized both revolution and empire at the same time. The Napoleonic Empire was to sweep away the ancient empires of Europe and replace them with a shiny new empire, a modern empire with modern laws, the Code Napoleon. Instead of offering populations the forced choice between conversion or death, as in past ages, Napoleon offered the nations of Europe the choice between being a part of the French Empire and accepting the Code Napoleon, or being forced to accept his rule at the point of a sword as a defeated enemy. We can see this as an attempt at a great synthesis of the forces of European history, combining republicanism and imperialism, the striving for new forms of order side by side with a nostalgic yearning for stability and peace. But we can also see this as a confused muddle of ideas. Felix Markham, again, whom I referenced earlier, in his book Napoleon and the Awakening of Europe, argues that Napoleon offered a synthesis of monarchy and liberalism, and that in attempting to refashion his legacy during his last years on the island of St. Helena, Napoleon presented himself such that, quote, he always wanted peace, but the dynasties of the Ancien Regime would not allow it. If he had been given time, he would have fulfilled national aspirations, unquote. And then Markham quotes Napoleon as saying, quote, there are in Europe more than 30 million French, 15 million Spanish, 15 million Italians, and 30 million Germans. I would have wished to make each of these peoples a single united body, unquote. And then another quote attributed to Napoleon, quote, Europe thus divided into nationalities, freely formed and free internally, peace between states would become easier. The United States of Europe would become a possibility, unquote. But what can fulfilling national aspiration mean under French domination? How could the other nations of Europe participate in French nationalism? A nationalism that is subject to France and presided over by a puppet government installed by the emperor, and as often as not, the puppet was a member of the emperor's family, is no nationalism at all. It is, on the contrary, an affront to nationalism. However, one could argue that Napoleon was instrumental in the rise of European nationalism precisely because he attempted to conquer all of Europe and install his own puppet regimes for other peoples. With confusions like this, it's not difficult to give it's difficult to give an unambiguous account of either the appeal of Napoleon or of what he symbolized. Hegel, on the contrary, who was often viewed as an obscurantist, was able to give a clear and unambiguous account of the ideas and ideals that Napoleon symbolized. Hegel's philosophy, in a sense, captures the spirit of the time, the zeitgeist. Bertrand Russell, in the preface to his A History of Western Philosophy, noted the importance of political and military figures like Napoleon for the history of philosophy, no less than history itself. Quote, "My purpose is to exhibit philosophy as an integral part of social and political life, not as the isolated speculations of remarkable individuals, but as both an effect and as a cause of the character of the various communities in which different systems flourished. Even pure men of action are sometimes of great importance in this respect. Very few philosophers have influenced philosophy as much as Alexander the Great, Charlemagne, or Napoleon." Unquote. Just so, Napoleon shaped philosophy by shaping the lives of philosophers like Hegel. Hegel was a professor at Jena when the Battle of Jena-Auerstadt took place. He had to grab the manuscript for his first book, The Phenomenology of Spirit, which he had just finished the night before hostilities began, and run for his life. Hegel's rooms were ransacked by soldiers and his other manuscripts were scattered. Before escaping Jena, Hegel saw the emperor. This would have been sometime on the 13th, 14th, or 15th of October, 1806, since Napoleon arrived in Jena on the 13th. The Battle of Jena-Auerstadt was on the 14th, and Napoleon left Jena for Weimar on the 15th. In a letter to a friend, Hegel wrote, quote, "I saw the emperor, this world soul, riding out of the city on reconnaissance. It is indeed a wonderful sensation to see such an individual who, concentrated here at a single point, astride a horse, reaches out over the world and masters it. This extraordinary man, whom it is impossible not to admire," unquote. This quote has become quite well known, and one sometimes sees smirking references to the world spirit on horseback, but that's how Hegel saw things. Hegel theorized about what he called the concrete universal, and Napoleon was one of these concrete universals riding on an equally concrete horse. At the same time, Hegel's perspective is supremely abstract. Hegel wrote of the concrete universal, quote, "The universal is the self-identical, expressly so taken that in it the specific and the singular are contained. The specific, moreover, is the distinct or determinate, but so taken as to be universal in itself and also individual," unquote. Clear enough? David P. Jordan, in his book Napoleon and the Revolution, wrote, quote, "Hegel's Napoleon, stripped of anecdote, physical details, and personal description, is the embodiment of the French Revolution, its unwitting agent, and by inference, its savior," unquote. Hegel had sprinkled references to Napoleon throughout his lectures on the philosophy of history, including an abstract portrait of the man and his leadership, stripped of anecdote, physical details, and personal description, as David Jordan wrote, following his account of Robespierre and the Terror, and just a few pages before the end of the book. Quote, "Napoleon established himself as an individual will at the head of the state. He knew how to rule and soon settled the internal affairs of France. The avocats, ideologues, and abstract principle men who ventured to show themselves he sent to the right about, and the sway of mistrust was exchanged for that of fear and respect. He then, with the vast might of his character, turned his attention to foreign relations, subjected all Europe, and diffused his liberal institutions in every quarter. Greater victories were never gained. Expeditions displaying greater genius were never conducted, but never was the powerlessness of victory exhibited in a clearer light than then. The disposition of the peoples, that is, their religious disposition and that of their nationality, ultimately precipitated this colossus. And in France, constitutional monarchy, with the chart as its basis, was restored, unquote. These lectures on philosophy of history were first delivered in 1822 to 1823, a year after Napoleon had died, and 7 years after Napoleon had been effectively removed from European history by being exiled to the Atlantic island of St. Helena. After this, the spell of Napoleon remained strong for Hegel still. A year after Hegel had fled Jena from the advancing French, on 13 December 1807, Johann Gottlieb Fichte began his series of lectures in French-occupied Berlin, which were later published as Addresses to a German Nation. Fichte made it clear that he knew what the stakes were and that actual events had overtaken the ideals of the French Revolution. Fichte, like Hegel, had once admired the ideals that Napoleon symbolized, but events had forced him to reassess what the French were about under the leadership of Napoleon. Quote, "I know very well what I risk. I know that a bullet may kill me like Palm, but it is not this that I fear. For my cause I would gladly die," unquote. The reference was to a bookseller in Braunau, Johann Philipp Palm, who had been executed on Napoleon's order on the 25th of August, 1806, though some accounts give a date of 26 August, 1806, for having forwarded a package that included a pamphlet that was critical of the French occupation of Bavaria. Fichte was not, in fact, shot as a consequence of his public lectures, but he was right to recognize this as a possible outcome. Too many philosophers have been oblivious to the ground shifting below their feet, as the ground of European politics shifted repeatedly during the Napoleonic Wars. The campaigns of Napoleon and the Grande Armée led to the collapse of many traditional dynasties, which contributed to a sense of uncertainty and anxiety throughout Europe. Those who were not initially enamored by the ideals of the French Revolution, as were Fichte and Hegel, saw in the conquests of revolutionary France a force sweeping across Europe that could bring revolution and terror to their countries. And so it was that many traditional enemies in Europe were able to unite and put aside their differences to form a common front against Napoleon. For them, as for Clausewitz, Napoleon was not a symbol of an ideal, but a symbol of chaos and destruction. The Napoleonic Wars were one of the many catastrophic punctuations of European history, preceded by the Black Death and the 30 Years' War, and followed by the world wars of the 20th century. But the point made by Hegel and Jocke and many others was that all the suffering from these disasters was not pointless. Philosophers as theoretically and as temperamentally diverse as Spengler and Husserl understood that the suffering had its origin in the same germ that was the source of the Western tradition. What Spengler called Faustian civilization, incommensurable with all other civilizations, was an infinite striving that couldn't help but to overreach and to suffer for it. And what Husserl would call the ideal of Europe and of European civilization was developing throughout and despite all these disasters. Rationality, whether it be Hegelian rationality or Husserlian rationality, was the ultimate ideal, always on the horizon of Western history. Western history is the result of both the achievements and the catastrophes. We cannot have one without the other. Dark times and dark ages are all a part of the bargain. Happy birthday, Napoleon Bonaparte. Vive l'Empereur, and thanks for listening.